So I'm here with Chauncey K. Robinson. And how would you describe yourself? I mean, I know you're a film critic, you're an advocate of social justice, you've done a lot of journalism and writing, but how would you describe yourself?
Well, that pretty much describes it pretty well. I do politics. I am an editor for People's World and also a cultural journalist, verified Rotten Tomatoes film and TV critic. And I really love intertwining politics and culture because I think nothing's apolitical, and I really like by diving into culture I can explore, class dynamics and things in a more popular front sort of way that draws people in who might not normally think about it. So that's kind of my angle a lot of the time.
Yeah, I took a look at your review of the new Joker movie.
Yeah.
Can you kind of summarize that for us?
Yeah, well, when I saw it on opening night when it came out, and I thought of the title as soon as the film ended. I was like, this is about a broken class system that creates its own monsters. And not in the sense of justifying, if anyone knows Joker, the DC Comics villain, he's infamous. He's a villain, there's nothing getting around that. But the way that this movie did it, which I really appreciated, that it put in the context of the 1980s, right? Very intense political and economical strife that was going on. There was a lot of poverty, things of that nature. And then you had this character who, suffered from mental illness, was living in poverty. Budget cuts are happening. He can't get to his medicine. There's a lot of things that made it so that he was extremely marginalized. And now that doesn't mean that everyone who has mental illness, everyone who's extremely marginalized ends up going towards a life of crime, but it's a very real reality of that feeling of isolation and frustration that he felt. And I felt like the movie was a good kind of reflection of what can happen in the vacuum of a lack of leadership, and that chaos and destruction can take hold. And that's what we saw in the film. And it was not just some villain that comes from out of nowhere, but comes from the very society that we live in. I mean, that was 1980s, you had Reaganomics that came about within that time frame and whatnot. And I think that was just a reflection of that, the rise of the new right at the time. And I so appreciated the social layers and commentary there. It wasn't completely positive, and I won't give it that. It definitely had a very downtrodden view of what happens to humanity. But I think the way I saw it was that things can go either way. We have to be the ones to decide what direction it's going to go in.
Very interesting. Now, speaking of cutbacks and neoliberalism and the gutting of the welfare state and the cuts in social spending on infrastructure, you've written a lot about the Flint water crisis and the lack of purification of drinking water. Can you describe that? Because I understand it's much wider than just Flint, right?
No, yeah. The thing is, there's a Flint in usually every state. There's places, cities, predominantly that are people of color, predominantly that are working class, working poor folk who are dealing with a lack of proper infrastructure, a lack of responsibility by the government officials, by the system, and allowing for what many are describing as environmental racism. We talk about the whole thing of climate change, of environmental issues, but a lot of times what gets overlooked, when we talk about the polar ice caps, is what goes on in cities, in places where people's drinking water, people's livelihood, where they can build their homes during flood areas. And Flint, with the water crisis that's happening there, is a reflection of that. What occurred was that Governor Snyder at the time, to save a few dollars after he made a lot of tax breaks for the rich, basically decided to so-called purify this water that hadn't been used for years because of the, General Motor plants and the lumber of the history of Flint, of the industry that had been there, had left the drinking water there in particular just like unusable. But to save a few dollars, they decided to use it again. And of course, they cut a lot of corners. They didn't do the kind of science that they needed to do, but it wasn't their top priority because who was predominantly living there and predominantly lives there at the time now are African Americans and people who are working class. And so what happened for some years, people were drinking water that had an extremely high lead of a neurotoxin, which is lead. I mean, we say lead and we hear that a lot, but it can kind of become a buzzword. We're like, oh, it's lead, lead is bad. But to know that it's an actual neurotoxin that can particularly affect younger generations. So what you're seeing is a poisoning of future generations of Black and brown children, of people of color, of working class people, that we're seeing in this very country is, this idea, oh, we're not a third world, we don't, treat our citizens like that. But that's very much not the case, depending on what class you belong to and what color your skin is. And Flint is a reflection of that.
We're one of the most developed countries in the world, yet
Yes.
we have people, drinking water that's not properly purified. We have all kinds of, bad living conditions. I think that's something that you've talked about a lot. And another thing that I think I've seen a lot in your work is you talk about the fact that the USA isn't as democratic as it purports to be. And you've specifically highlighted the issue of voter suppression. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, for sure. The thing about voter suppression is that it's very high stakes. One of the things, we have a person who inhabits the White House right now, Trump, and one of the things that, and it's not just him, right? It's this idea that the right has been pushing voter fraud. That's the talking point that they use. And there's been a systematic and this has been fueled by the Koch brothers and others who want to suppress the vote, particularly of working class people, particularly of people of color who are known to vote usually left-leaning or Democrat, right? And this, we saw a big push of this around we saw what people called it the white lash or the backlash or whatnot. But we saw this voter suppression handbook that they sort of started to push a little bit after President Barack Obama was elected. And so what you saw was, the increase of certain laws being put into place about if you move from one spot, a lot of gerrymandering, which, happens on both ends. It's not just, Republicans that do that. But this was a very concentrated effort to make it so they realized that they couldn't get a lot of working class people and the growing majority that is, Black and brown that we're seeing, because there will be a majority of people of color in the US by the year like 2050, that they couldn't get a majority of them vote for Republican or right. So instead of, trying to win them over, they make it so that they can't vote, so they don't get counted. That was the strategy. It's just as simple as that. And there were a lot of systemic laws and a lot of policies put into place to make it so that people couldn't get to the polls. And the thing is, this isn't new in our history. After the legal end of slavery, one of the things was that Black people got the right to vote. And then, with the failure of radical Reconstruction, there was a lot of, the poll tax. We're seeing a poll tax, a modern day poll tax now happening in Florida and other places. And these are things that the Black codes, these were things that they already put in place. And the main goal is to suppress democracy, what we can consider true democracy. I mean, yes, there's it's not true democracy here, but that's a facet of it that we did fight for. They didn't give it to us. We fought for it. And so they're attacking it now with a lot of the voter suppression. And
like the idea is they're putting up barriers to prevent people from voting, like multiple forms of ID required. Of course, you have to pay money to get ID. I mean, can you talk into the specifics you said about changing the rules that if you move, like what specifically are they doing to prevent people from voting?
Well, there's a number of things. You have it so that you have certain people who consider themselves like dutiful citizens who then challenge someone's right to vote depending on how long it's been since they voted, which, challenges is the idea of, a person has the right to vote, like it's your God-given, it's your right to vote, and that it shouldn't be something like use it or lose it. And so what you have is particular in certain places where citizens, they tend to have agendas, they can challenge someone's right to vote. They can send a letter themselves, and if that person doesn't respond, they can then challenge them and go to like a town hall and basically say this person didn't respond, they must not live there anymore. You have to take them from the rolls. A lot of time what you have is someone isn't able to make it to a hearing. They didn't get the letter that said that they needed to come to a hearing because some person was challenging their right to vote. So what happens is the person who's challenging it, who has their own project to, and is targeting certain kind of members, they go there, the person's stricken from the rolls because they didn't show up, they didn't take off work that day, they didn't get the letter. And then suddenly come voting day, they go there thinking they have a right to vote, and they're told, well, you were taken from the roll. And so this happens a lot of the times. Other times, what occurs is certain polling places are closed down. And when you have people who think that, oh, this is always going to, like the elderly, people who work in certain places, they think that they have this spot that they're supposed to go to. Then they find out that polling place has been closed, or their polling place they're supposed to go to has been changed to maybe like across town. Just a whole lot of red tape just to basically stop people from basically being able to exert what should be their natural right to be able to vote in their democracy, supposedly. So there's things like that. And then there's other aspects. One of the things is propaganda. One of the things I like to talk about, especially with culture, you have propaganda where, like I mentioned earlier, the idea of voter fraud, that was used as a counter to the very real threat of voter suppression. And there's this really great documentary called The Voter Suppression Playbook that I did a review on. And one of the things they talked about, one of the talking points of the right, was voter fraud. This mythical person who's going to multiple places to vote multiple times, and that's who you really need to worry about, and you need to strict them from the rolls. And a lot of intimidation. Once again, things that isn't new, happened way back then as well, still happening now, making it so people are afraid to go and vote because, they go there and there's a mishap and then they get arrested. You can go away for 5 years. These are people who, want to avoid law enforcement for, very valid reasons and things. So there's a mixture. There's legal, there's extra legal, and there's intimidation tactics that all come to suppress a certain part of our population that the right wing is very much afraid of in exerting their right to vote.
You mentioned radical reconstruction. And, if you read, and I've read W.B. Du Bois and his history of Reconstruction, where he talks about what a hopeful period that was, where there was talk of land redistribution. There was a lot of progressive measures happening. Can you go over that? Because there's so much out there. People have seen Gone with the Wind and awful, historical revisionism like that just tells the opposite of the truth.
Yeah, well, what we saw with and when we talk about radical reconstruction, a lot of time what people start from is the failure of radical reconstruction and what that meant. And really what that was a selling out of democracy. People made certain groups, certain parties made compromises that pretty much sold out the democracy of black people in this country. And, what we saw with radical reconstruction was that there were a few things passed. There was the idea of, reparations. The thought of that was a big thing. I did a story about, because it's recently come back around, the question of reparations and what that means for people who have you can call it ancestors, but it wasn't that long ago. We have family members, great grand parents who were the victims of slavery, and what that means in terms of the generational disadvantage and oppression that happens to us up until today. And one of the things with radical reconstruction was was combating of that, right? You had it so that people, the chance to vote, to actually get elected to office, to go from being an enslaved person to actually being able to hold office, things of that nature, just things that were very empowering to a part of the population that had been so oppressed up to that point. And then what happened, in a way of what we see on a more violent level back then, was the push of, once again, you call it white lash or whatever. But what you had was like the emergence of the KKK, which was backed by certain politicians and things, because it wasn't just some, people in backwoods or whatever who just decided they didn't, like that these black people were getting more rights. This was, once again, a concentrated effort to push back against what people saw was a losing of their power, a losing of their wealth, usually, the ruling class in that regard. And so you had terrorism, domestic terrorism of the KKK, once again, intimidation tactics, lynching, people getting killed, intimidated not to, exert their rights. And basically kind of, for lack of a better word, kind of thrown to the wolves in that regard when compromises were made and their rights were pretty much taken out. And we haven't really bounce back from that, because like I said, with the whole idea of the question of reparations, you have it so that that's still a topic people don't want to address, because what that would mean to address the validation of reparations, as I explained in my article that I wrote about it, that acknowledging reparations for Black people in the U.S. who have been affected by this oppression wouldn't just be like, oh, let's give you a certain amount of money. It would have to acknowledge the fact that this country was built, the wealth of this country was built on slave labor, was built on unpaid labor, because that's what it really gets down to. You had people who worked who didn't get their just due. You know, they were super exploited. And we have generations of the haunting of that history very much has followed Black people in the U.S. to this day. And when you acknowledge reparations, you're saying that there's still a systemic issue of oppression, of anti-Blackness, of white supremacy that's embedded within our system, that's still affecting those generations of people from that very time that the wealth of this nation was built off of. You have banks and things who got their wealth off of the slave trade, and to acknowledge that would be the need to acknowledge just how deep it goes.
Well, you know, it's interesting because if you listen to these neo-Confederates talk, they'll give you this narrative like, well, we were defending our homes and communities. But what they leave out is the fact that the main force propping up the slave system was the British Empire. They needed that textile, cotton, that cheap cotton for their textile mills. And Wall Street was also very heavily involved. And it was, in the North, it was the industrial capitalists, it was the abolitionists, it was the labor unions. It was a progressive upsurge that fought to bring down slavery. I mean, a widespread strike among the slaves themselves. I mean, it's just an untold story, and so much lying and deception has gone on about it. But we don't have as much time today as I hoped we would have, but I see behind you, you've got a poster for one of my favorite movies. I love
Which one?
Peter Cushing. I love the Hammer horror films, the classic, it's like the perfect medium, I've always felt, right? Because the modern slasher horror is not really up my alley, but then the real old tinty black and white Universal Studios stuff, can't really take it too seriously. But I find that the Hammer films of the 50s, 60s, and 70s out of Britain, the low budget, Terrence Fisher, the director, I find that stuff to be almost like the perfect medium. So I hope we can talk about that some more. You seem to be particularly interested in horror movies, right?
Oh, I love horror movies. One of the things about the horror genre is because I feel like it's probably the perfect space to talk politics at times. You have a lot of films that like John Carpenter's They Live, which was basically an FU to Reaganomics. It doesn't get its just due in that regard of the horror genre because of the fact of the way that B movies and the fact that the powers that be didn't pay attention as much. So what you had a lot of the time with horror films is that they slipped in a lot of social commentary. It didn't just start now. So-called elevated horror didn't just start now. You've had so many. I can talk for a very long time about the politics of horror and just how it can be a very empowering genre, which is one of the reasons why I love it.
Well, that's what we're going to have to talk about next time, I think.
Yes.
But I'm going to post this first conversation. I'm sure the viewers are going to love it. So thank you very much. And where can people find your work, more information about you, et cetera?
You can find my published articles at People's World, where, I talk about film and TV, but I also talk about other political events, peoplesworld.org. It's in the history of the Daily Worker, 98 years going. And you can also find my video reviews and the published articles on Rotten Tomatoes, as I'm a verified Rotten Tomatoes film and TV critic, and also my YouTube channel, which is Twisted Woman CKR, which is a little bit more focused on the horror and dark fantasy genre, but I still intertwine my social commentary within there.
Now, People's World is from the Communist Party, right?
Well, yes, the Communist Party, other socialists, activists, workers helped to found the Daily Worker. That's in the history of the People's World. So it was a culmination of people, but the party, the Communist Party, is very much a very large ally and supporter of our publication.
Very exciting. Okay, well, next time we'll talk more about horror movies. Sorry to cut this short, but it was really a pleasure to speak with you, Chauncey. So talk to you soon, okay?
Yeah, you too. Bye.